Chapter 8, Objections. There is a risk that the importance of the conclusions to which the two preceding chapters point will be judged by the number of objections to which those conclusions give rise. I hope to gain from criticism, and I do not want to repress it. But the reader will appreciate my dealing with the doubts that have very likely come over him so far in my trying to dispel them. There are, I think, 4 objections, and they are as follows. Number 1, the religion of the Cathars is simply imperfectly understood, and it is therefore at the very least premature to assume that this religion was the source or a chief source of courtly poems. Number 2, the troubadours never admitted being of this religion and never stated that this religion was the subject of their poetry. Number 3, on the contrary, the love which they extol is but the idealization or sublimation of sexual desire. Number 4, out of a confused mixture of Manichaean and Neoplatonic doctrines operating upon a background of Celt-Iberian traditions, it is difficult to see how there could have arisen a rhetoric as highly elaborate as that of the troubadours. With those objections, I shall deal seriatim. I don't know what the fuck that is. Number 1, a religion imperfectly understood. If the Catharist religion were not known at all, then the problem of courtly lyric poetry would remain completely obscure, as the authorities on Romance languages allow. For my part, I cannot regard as absurd a poetic and morality of love, out of which were to come in later centuries the most splendid of Western literary works. Furthermore, certain points about Catharist rites and beliefs have now been established beyond dispute. The origins of the heresy are Manichaean. When we recall what was said above about the essentially lyrical character of Manichaean dogmas in general, it emerges that any small piece of additional information about this or that qualification or alteration to which the dogmas were subject in the Southern Church would not weigh much either for or against what I am contending. What should be looked for in courtly rhetoric is not rational or precise equivalences of the dogma, but the lyrical and psalmodic development of the fundamental symbolism. Likewise, to take a modern example, the Christian sentiment which is discerned in the poetry of Baudelaire is not a term-for-term transposition of Catholic dogma. It is rather the manifestation of a certain and even of a definite sensibility which, but for Catholic dogma, could not be imagined, and to this are added elements of vocabulary and syntax which are unmistakably of liturgical origin. It is not going too far to suppose that the strains which we have noted in the work of the Provençal poets stand in a similar relation to Neo-Manichaeism. For that matter, the heretical tonality of the set phrases and expressions in the rhetoric of courtly love becomes evident as soon as those phrases and expressions are compared with the clerical poetry of the period. A specialist as skeptical as Jean Roy does not fail to notice it. Writing of the abstract lyrical poetry of the troubadours of the 13th century and how it tends to fuse God and the Lady of Thoughts, he writes, "It will be said that these are but rhetorical figures without consequence. Nevertheless, the question is, are not the theories which the troubadours developed with their grave intentness at the antipodes of Christianity?" I hope it's antipodes and not antipodes. They might have noticed it, and why in their poems is there no hint of that internal rift, of that dissidio, which renders some of Petrarch's verses so full of pathos? What the fuck else? Number 2, the troubadours keep the secret. To the theory that the troubadours 2. The troubadours keep the secret. To the theory that the troubadours were secretly Cathars, several recent writers have objected that no courtly poet ever gave away the show even after being converted to Catholic Orthodoxy. That is to attribute to a man of the 12th century a form of consciousness which he could not possibly have. If we try to place ourselves in the medieval atmosphere, it becomes clear that the absence of any symbolical meaning in a poem would have been something far more offensive than it can be now. Far more offensive then than it can be now. To a medieval man, everything meant some other things, as in dreams, and this without any translation into concepts on his part. That is to say, he had no need to formulate the meaning of the symbols he used, nor to become fully conscious of them. He was innocent of the rationalism, which causes people today to abstract and empty of all significant overtones the objects to which they attend. Footnote 1. For example, in the Middle Ages, a man was too naive to be able to devote himself to any material he deemed absurd, that is, material which lacked a religious significance and a fixed position in the scheme of values he accepted. One of the best historians of medieval manners, Huizinga, provides a pertinent instance of this in the behavior of Suso the mystic. And that's footnote 2, which is just the title, The Waning of the Middle Ages. Okay. One of the best historians of medieval manners, Huizinga, provides a pertinent instance of this in the behavior of Suso the mystic. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, two factors dominate religious life: the extreme saturation of the religious atmosphere and a marked tendency of thought to embody itself in images. Individual and social life in all their manifestations are imbued with the conceptions of faith. There is not an object or an action, however trivial, that is not constantly correlated with Christ or salvation. All thinking tends to religious interpretation of individual things. There is an enormous unfolding of religion in daily life. This spiritual wakefulness, however, results in a dangerous state of tension. For the presupposed transcendental feelings are sometimes dormant, and whenever this is the case, all that is meant to stimulate spiritual consciousness is reduced to appalling commonplace profanity, to a startling worldliness and otherworldly guise. Even in the case of a sublime mystic like Henry Suso, the craving for hallowing every action of daily life verges in our eyes on the ridiculous. He is sublime when, following the usages of profane love, he celebrates New Year's Day and May Day by offering a wreath and a song to his betrothed, eternal wisdom. Or when, out of reverence for the Holy Virgin, he renders homage to all womankind and walks in the mud to let a beggar woman pass. But what are we to think of what follows? That table Suso eats 3/4 of an apple in the name of the Trinity, and the remaining quarter in commemoration of, quote, the love with which the Heavenly Mother gave her tender child Jesus an apple to eat, end of quote. And for this reason he eats the last quarter with the paring, as little boys do not peel their apples. After Christmas he does not eat it, for then the infant Jesus was too young to eat apples. He drinks in 5 draughts because of the 5 wounds of the Lord, but as blood and water flowed from the side of Christ, he takes his last draught twice. This is, indeed, pushing the sanctification of life to extremes, end of quote. be held that this is a drop from symbol into allegory? Certainly, but carried to an evident excess. Huizinga remarks some pages later that the simple religious sense of the people did not need to have its faith intellectually justified. The visible image of holy things was enough to establish their reality. This shows that in the eyes of the initiated and in those of sympathizers with the Church of Love, the secret of the troubadours served as a symbolical witness. In the ordinary way, it could not occur to anyone that the symbols were invalid unless expounded and accounted for in non-symbolical fashion. A contrary objection has been raised. How is it that no converted Cathar ever gave away the troubadours as being propagators of the heresy? That, however, is easily answered. Obviously, the troubadours were not looked upon as either preachers or missionaries, at most as believers, and more often as merely sympathetic and friendly. Anyhow, such distinctions were much less sharp than they are now. The troubadours, for the benefit of a public in which the majority favored the heresy, made up their lays about a kind of love which happened to correspond and to respond to a very difficult moral situation. The situation that had been produced both by the religious condemnation of sexuality by the perfect and by a natural revolt against the orthodox conception of marriage which had recently been affirmed afresh in the Gregorian reform. They had accordingly to protect themselves on two flanks, against the severity of the perfect and against the severity of Catholics. Nevertheless, it is easy to understand that the peculiar position of heretics caused some poets to be very discreet in indicating that, apart from the habitual symbolism, which spoke for itself, their work possessed an exact double meaning. Hence, symbols were sometimes vehicles of allegory as well and took on a cryptographic guise. This happened with the school of the Trobar-Cluse, to which I have already referred. While on the subject of this school, Jean Roy remarks, quote, "Another way of baffling the reader was to put a sacred notion into profane dress, and to apply to divine love phrases appropriated by custom to the expression of human love," end of quote. He claims not, quote, to be able to unravel, end of quote, the causes of this, quote, singular perversion of taste in a form of literature that had newly arisen, end of quote. The troubadour Allégret has, however, declared significantly, quote, "My verse must seem nonsense to fools who cannot understand it in two ways. If someone wishes to challenge this line, let him come forward, and I shall show him how it was possible to put in two, variant 3, words with various meanings," end of quote. There is no reason to suppose that the troubadours engaged in this skillful confusing of the sense. Entrebescar, the Provençals called it, meaning to interweave. Merely as a literary exercise for the purpose of, quote, puzzling their hearers with conundrums, end of quote. Quote, "I interweave words rare, dark, and colorful, pensively pensive," end of quote. Rambout of Orange writes, and Macabre says, quote, "Wise beyond a doubt, I hold him who divines what each word in my song means," end of quote. Is it true that he adds, sally or precaution, quote, because I myself am hard put to it to light up my dark speech," end of quote. How far a troubadour himself understood the deep purport of his symbols is something indeed that cannot be determined. After all, the general run of human beings are very little conscious of using metaphors. Footnote 1. If some inarticulate man copies the letters he sends to his beloved out of a textbook, it does not follow that the expressions he uses do not seem to him to express his true and sincere emotion. What I quoted above about the artless way in which medieval people accepted symbolism needs to be borne in mind. Symbols were not translatable into prosaic and rational concepts. The question has therefore only to be asked concerning the double allegorical meaning. Furthermore, all this poetry was being produced in an atmosphere highly charged with passion. The happenings recorded in contemporary chronicles are among the wildest and most surrealist in the history of European manners. A jealous lord killed his wife's favorite troubadour and had the dead man's heart served up to her on a dish. The lady ate it without knowing what it was, her lord having told her, "Sir," she said, "you have given me such a delicious dish that never shall I partake of any other." And she threw herself out of the window of the keep. In an atmosphere where such events were possible, poets, it will be agreed, can have had no difficulty in coloring a symbolism originally dogmatic.